Welcome back to the True Crime Lounge podcast here on YouTube and Spotify. I do have a Patreon that you can join for early access to episodes scheduled to come out. I also have a merch shop for all your true crime gear. For any updates on my channel or podcast, you can find me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. With that being said, let's dive into today's episode, shall we? On today's episode, it's going to be a bit of a long one, just a heads up. I possibly might divide it up into two parts. Really just depends on how long I can talk because I've done like five of these already today, so my voice is running dry. But I also am in school, so I gotta get some schoolwork done at the same time. But also, happy St. Patrick's Day. Um, on today's episode, we're going to be discussing the case of Diane Augat, one of the oldest unsolved missing persons cases in is Diane Augat. In 1998, a 30-year-old Diane Augat of Odessa, Florida, walked out of her home, vanished without a trace 10 years prior to disappearance, and received a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. It was so severe that it led to her losing custody of her children and her husband divorcing her in 1991. She would cope by self-medication and with alcohol and drugs. On April 10th, 1998, she left her home and was never seen again. The events that followed, you would think that it would be of a Hollywood movie. 3 days after she vanished, her answering machine would go, "Help, help, let me out," followed by a "Hey, give me that." This sounded like a struggle was going on in the background while trying to fight over the phone. According to the caller ID, it says Starlight. However, it was Diane's mom who called back and said that there was no answer. 2 days after this the severed tip of Diane's right middle finger was found. 2 weeks later, a bag of clothing was found in a freezer of a local convenience store. Diane Augat was 40 when she disappeared on April 10th, 1998. She walked away from her sister's home in Huston, Florida, and she was later spotted in the surrounding area the next few days. A couple of shocking discoveries would lead investigators to discover that she would meet foul play. On Wednesday, April 15, 1998, 59-year-old Mildred Young heard a young woman's voice over the answering machine saying, "Help, help, help, let me out," in a tense and alarmed tone that was going on around her. This was followed by a scuffing sound that made it clear someone on the other end was attempting to pull it away. And from the woman speaking, the woman on the other end of the phone could be of her saying, "Hey, give me that," before coming to answer. While most wouldn't think twice of a call, it was a malicious and prank of some sort. Mildred Young knew better. After all, her daughter, a woman with diagnosed mental illness, and a number of troubling personal struggles, relationships, had already been missing for several days, and the woman's voice, um, from the other end of the phone was unmistakable. So, what's the story of Diane Augat? Diane Louise Augat was born on February 21st, 1958, to the parents of James and Mildred Young. While Diane grew up in New York, she would end up relocating to Florida, along with the rest of her family in the area surrounding Tampa, which is where she would begin to plant her roots. In late 1970s, Diane would marry Frederick Augat, taking his surname for a time, and she seemed to have a pretty idyllic life, becoming a stay-at-home wife and taking care of the couple's three children, two daughters and a son. Not only doting upon her children, but making it a point to a pride to keep a neat and orderly home. Diane's sister, would later recall she had $100 pocketbook. She was pretty, and that there could be 1,000 people in the room. and you noticed her. Unfortunately, in the late 1980s, after briefly after a briefly period of bizarre behavior, Diane would be diagnosed with manic depressive disorder, which we would now call bipolar. Um, she would begin to treat mental illness with medication, but would begin would begin to issue treatment to a number of perceived reasons, none of them which was any good, and her mental illness began to suffer as a result. In 1998, in 1988, my bad, Diane would allegedly have committed child abuse by the state alleged her sought excessive amount of unneeded treatment for one of her children, a mental illness we now know as Munchkin's by proxy. While she would ultimately be acquitted of these charges, the state would continue to pursue a case against her, believing the charges to have good merit. Elaine Fulton Jones, a spokeswoman for Child and Families, would later state about Diane and her three children. The children were removed from her custody. In 1991, after a short period of turbulent behavior, Diane and her longtime husband, Frederick, would divorce. He would retain custody of the children, and this would become the nail in the coffin um, for Diane's mental health. So, over the next several years, Diane would begin to unravel. Um, with her with her being in and out of only local jails but mental health facilities as well. Her brother-in-law Al Finkelstein, that just sounds like a very fun name to say, I'm not gonna lie, Finkelstein, um, would later recount reporters in the area. He would go on to say that she was constantly talking to herself, and you can tell right away she's ill. Her own mom, Mildred, would later recall that she hangs out with whomever will be her friend. She's sick, and you can't deal with her whenever she's manic and she gets in your face and doesn't shut up. Diane would develop a drinking problem during this period, and would also begin to dabble in drug use. Both of both of which did nothing to exacerbate her already existing issues. She was already involuntarily committed at mental hospital facilities at least 32 times under the Baker Act, which basically, according to the Baker Act, basically allows a judge, police officer, doctor, whether or not someone is mentally ill enough to pose as a danger threat to themselves. The most recent of these involuntary committals came in 1998, which resulted from being released to the care of a loved one in the spring. However, according to Diane Augat's family member, she should have never been released. Her mother, Mildred, would tell the Tampa Bay Times that, and she's going to say that she's a deeply needed institutionalized care. On April 10th, 1998, Good Friday to be exact, Diane Augat was seen alive by her family for the very last time. Diane had been released from a mental health facility roughly 2 weeks prior, and after being sent there for an involuntary evaluation, um, and being held, staying in the state of Hudson, while Diane had previously been living in Odessa, her family thought it would be best for her to be with her family at this time. On the morning of April 10th, Diane was last seen by her sister, who ended up leaving her for a doctor's appointment that morning, which, when she returned that day, she later found Diane missing from the home, and it would be reported that Diane left her sister's home, along the cobblestone driveway in Hudson at around 11 o'clock a.m. Later that day, Diane would be seen in the Hayloft Tavern located along Little Road and State Road 52. There, Diane stayed until she was kicked out of the house, where Diane's mother Mildred later recounting that to cut her off from walking in circles to her knowledge that was the last anyone seen of her except for the one who took her. Diane's family would report her missing the next day. While her family, while Diane had been known to disappear in the past, she generally only did so a day or two. This was usually when she lapsed on her medication and simply didn't stop taking them, or just simply stopped taking them. But in the case, Diane would go on missing for several days, leaving mysterious voicemails received by her mom, April 15th. So while publications tend to vary on whether not exactly she that day this call came in, it is most reputably reported to have been heard that Diane's mom on Wednesday, April 15th, 5 days after her last known sighting, other publications claim it was received on April 13th. In the call, Diane could be heard asking for help on the other end of the phone, but struggles to keep control over the phone of mysterious individual taking it from her. To her loved ones, this call seemed to confirm that Diane was in serious trouble this time. Um, Especially since this was her longest and most unusual disappearing act yet. When Mildred would attempt to call back at the number Diane had dialed her from, the number would say Starlight, which would appear on the caller ID, indicating that this was a business name. That was the name. But attempts to redial would go unanswered. In digging, if there was like the business is a Tampa area with the name. Is a strip club named there's a strip club named the Starlight Lounge, but it's unknown if there was any connection between the two. So on Wednesday, April 15th, 5 days after Diane left her sister's home in Hudson, a human finger was found along Route 19 near New York Avenue, and the discovery was made around 4 o'clock p.m. by a woman walking to work who thought that the finger was just a toy or a prop of sort, but the woman told her boyfriend where he discovered it and which will be painted as nail polish was real. He would then reach out to the Pasco County Sheriff's Department, who later arrived at the scene shortly thereafter. While it was reported that the two fingers were found at the location, police have revealed that it was only one, and that it's just been that's been the official narrative ever since. In an attempt to figure out who the finger belonged to, authorities can match it up with their own records. Ow, my feet hurt. Um, and quickly discovered that the finger belonged to a missing Diane Augat. Because Diane had been arrested in the past and her fingerprints were already in the system. But she had been fingerprinted and was unfortunately a match. While investigators would theorize that the finger might have accidentally been severed, perhaps slammed into a corridor or something, the likelihood what believed was quiet. Authorities would begin to search the scene through the area where her finger was found, and would even bring out a helicopter to scan the area. Unfortunately, the efforts would prove to be fruitless, and no other trace of the missing 40-year-old woman would be found. A number of attempts to find her at her home, or regular hunts were very unsuccessful in the days and weeks to come. Police did not. Oh. So the police did not believe that Diane left on her own with John Powers, the spokesman. So left on her own. John Powers, the spokesman for Pasco County Sheriff's, would tell reporters that she apparently did not have a vehicle. She either hitchhiked or got rides from friends. The pair with Diane overly trusting's behavior was off her medication led investigators to believe that she might have willingly gone alone with someone intending to not do any harm. On this, Pasco County spokesman would state that when Diane did not return to take her medication correctly, her personality would change. And during these bouts, she would hang out with the pretty rough crowd. When asked for her thoughts on what might have happened to her missing daughter, Diane's mother, Mildred, hoped for the best, but clearly claimed to be preparing for the worst, saying she's in trouble, big trouble. They're possibly torturing her. I'm oh, I'm hoping that she's still alive and that they haven't killed her yet. On the same day, Diane's disappearance began to break in the Tampa area. A discovery would be made in the convenience store that Diane often frequented. This occurred in Odessa, Florida, about 25 miles north of Tampa. On, Septem- on Saturday, April 18th, 1998, a convenience store manager, Patricia Savendorio. I apologize if I'm butchering that up. I am terrible with names. So be patient with me, please. Oh. Um, would discover of how a neatly folded clothes inside the store's freezer. Immediately recognizing the clothes of Diane Augat, Patricia would reach out to Deborah, Diane's sister, who's confirmed the clothes were in fact Diane's. Police would immediately begin to theorize that the clothes would have been in the freezer by some point of the people that Diane had been hanging out with in the weeks preceding to her disappearance. Authorities also believe that the same individuals who were described as juveniles in the newspaper's report had stated that Diane's home along the 1700 block of Chesapeake Drive at the same time that she disappeared. It was believed that Diane had allowed three youngsters to hang out in her home and throw parties while she was gone, but they were also betraying her trust in her absence, moving items out of her home without her consent. There's a possible theory I have in my head developing right now. Unfortunately, it was almost impossible to determine when the clothing had been put in the outdoor freezer. Since the staff of the convenience store had not checked it in approximately 3 weeks, Diane had been missing for about 8 days at the time of discovery, making this an unknown variable as well. Over the next several weeks, authorities will receive a dozen tips with potential witnesses that believe to have been Diane in the surrounding area. This included one witness who claimed to have seen her in the afternoon of April 11th between 3 p.m. and 4 p.m. walking along New York Avenue. This would be put in her location with her finger found as well, and extended the last known whereabouts by her entire day, giving investigators another mysterious 24-hour period to go on. Another witness, a waitress at the end of Gulf and Hudson, would claim to have seen Diane later that day, and the same day that an anonymous tip was made by her parents, but is unknown to investigators ever available. If they did, this would have been they would have released the info on this of the years since. Unfortunately, none of these tips seem to pan out. So while investigators are being able to locate any of Diane's other than her long severed finger, her case began to fade from the headlines by the end of April, and the story would languish in the press for more than 2 years. Despite the circumstances pointing out the harm in the befallen 40-year-old Diane Augat, she would be ruled a missing person from her disappearance, and her case will remain unsolved, or remain in the virtual stasis for the better part of the next few years. In November 2000, Diane's story would begin to make headlines in Tampa, beginning when Diane's parents reminisced about her lives openly, pointing out the things that she has started when her daughter was quickly evolved shortly after her daughter's mental illness began to reveal themselves, causing her to lose custody of her children, divorce her longtime husband, and begin to distance herself from the person she had once been. As a result, she became entirely, completely different, seemingly overnight, in that she had began to solace alcoholism and substance abuse. Costco, Costco County Sheriff's official would reiterate that they had continued to investigate the case and treat it as an ongoing investigation, not a cold case, as you expect. Nonetheless, Diane's loved ones would be left without answers. Her mom, forcing herself to question that no parent should ever have to ask, should ever have to ponder openly about her missing daughter.